Hey everybody. So today is probably actually my most favorite topic, and I think one of the most helpful things that we can learn with the voice. I mean, it's all important, but I think this is something that's typically overlooked because it's complicated. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the acoustics and the mechanism, but ultimately the goal here is application and being able to really feel this. Um, as always, singing is a tactile, feeling-based art form. So you can understand this from like a physics technical perspective, and that doesn't necessarily help you unless you really feel what this is like in your voice. But that being said, explaining a little bit about how it works just helps to demystify some things, and it helps you understand when someone doesn't maybe understand some of these technical aspects if they're a teacher. And particularly just certain red flags that you might hear. Just as always, there's tons of content out there about learning how to sing. Um, and some of it doesn't have that voice science background. And we can get lost in our perception of what's going on with the voice versus what's actually happening. And sometimes understanding these little things about it can really help you break maybe habits or preconceived notions that you have with your voice. The most fundamental thing is, why do we need resonance? It's how we sing with an effortless flow. It's how we keep our voice healthy. It's how we project our sound, because ultimately it is how the voice works. And so understanding formants is really like the key to unlocking a lot of different things about your voice. And we'll talk about how it fits into the whole system. Um, yes, resonance, right? And it's already kind of like a confusing concept, right? Like, we do have to explain a little bit of the physics behind it, because I think this term can be used sometimes and just goes over people's head if we're not really perceiving what resonance is and listening carefully to the sound. So in the simplest sense, you could think of resonance as that sort of like tinny, kind of pingy, ringing sound that you hear from a trained vocalist. Like, you'll hear it really clearly, especially like a classical singer. You'll hear that sort of high ring allows our voice to carry over an orchestra or an audience, right? Or just a bunch of other sounds that are happening at the same time. But resonance there's a lot of different strategies for finding resonance. And let's just go a little bit into explaining it. Please ask questions. And then, as always, we're going to really try to make this hands-on. It's a funny term, but we're going to try to sing through things and try to feel it in a physical way. Yes. No. There's more to it. What is resonance? So the key is in the term resounding resonance, right? So resonance. And the important thing to note is resonance is not the initiation of sound. It is something that helps to amplify sound by, think of like a one wave coming in, like a current of like an ocean or something like that, and then building up with these other waves that are synchronizing, and it's going to amplify and increase the size of the wave, right? So we actually do this with our voice. It's important to note that there's a different term, harmonics and resonance, and there actually are harmonics and formants being the main things, and it helps explain this difference. So I'm just going to go a little bit into this, and maybe sometime we can do like a deep dive into like understanding more about the acoustics and going more advanced. But the concept here is that harmonics are produced by our vocal folds. It is the initial push of sound, or the first wave, and resonance that we get from formants is sort of the next push. It's the thing that resounds, right? It's builds on that wave of the first push and allows the mechanism of our voice to work appropriately. So formants are the vocal tract itself. It's the air in the tract. Yes, resonance can definitely help with singing higher. In fact, you'll find if you don't understand resonance, you're usually going to have some limitations. So think about that, amplifying waves, right? And understanding how to amplify the right kinds of waves so that we can sing in each range, actually. So really is the key to unlocking every part of your range, because every sort of different part of your range, low chest voice, mixed middle voice, higher head voice, all have slightly different resonance strategies that help them work most efficiently. So that's why sometimes we get lost in like singing high and low. And I really think of it as just a handoff of resonance. And so we can break that notion of up and down that we tend to follow a lot, and really think about changing the position of our vocal tract. So formants, again, this concept that's really important for resonance, are the different ways that we shape our vocal tract. And they create, they sort of bump or filter that harmonic initial push, and they amplify certain sounds that we hear. And then they can actually dampen or dull other sounds. So the important thing to note is, like, unlike other instruments, the voice, we can actually change our resonators. We can change these formant shapes. Whereas, like, if you look at a cello or a violin, the shape of it is the same and it doesn't change. And so that's why it has that like violin or cello like sound. But a voice, we're like a chameleon. We have multiple options and ways to change our resonators, which adjusts our tone, allows us to switch different styles really easily, and helps us with all of these other sort of changes that we do with our voice. So it's really actually quite fascinating, and a lot of our understanding of resonance came from this curiosity with how the voice works. Um, uh, yeah. Oh, good, good, good. Yeah, I'll answer a lot of questions, but please keep asking them just in case I, forget things. And it's nice to sort of re-articulate them in different ways to help different people understand this. So um, again, the main thing here is we have a difference between harmonics and formants, right? So harmonics are the push the vocal folds, or it's the vocal folds coming together. And formants are the ways that we shape the vocal tract to give it an extra bump. Um, and it's important to note too, this is kind of like a fun fact that I really like to nerd out about. But when we produce a sound, there are many harmonics that are happening simultaneously, and so it's not just one vibration. There's tons of vibrations happening, and they follow this thing called the harmonic series, which is actually a very particular pattern that we hear in all sounds that are created, no matter what sound it is. If it's like a smacking of something, if it's a singing voice, everything we hear follows the harmonic series. It's part of like a function of the universe that we live in. And so it's important to note that when we sing a sound, all of the other pitches that we hear in the musical scale are all present. They're just different sort of volumes. So like as they go up higher and higher in the harmonic series, we hear them less and less. So I'm going to play the harmonic series, and you'll hear this when we start singing, that you can actually kind of hear your own voice doing that, especially as we move our resonators around to emphasize those notes of that harmonic series. So you could think of like, okay, people talk about overtones, right? What are overtones? Overtones are these higher harmonics that are in our sounds, and we can emphasize them more and create what we call overtone singing, right? That very particular kind of sound. And then we have our fundamental pitch, which is the one that we think of when we think of like matching a pitch, right? It's the bass or lowest sounding frequency. For the most part, there's subharmonics and other things too. It gets weirder as you go, but that's the one that we tend to hear the strongest, unless you're overtone singing, and all the other ones are there. So I'm going to play the harmonic series. It's sort of like the sound of the universe. So it sounds like this. We go. And then kind of keeps on going off forever. But that's the main part that we hear is this. And that's every time we make a sound, these notes are happening, and they're louder in the order that I played them, and then they get softer as they get higher and higher up. So that's already happening, and that's just the second we produce any sound. Now, when we change our resonator shapes, yeah, it's really actually quite amazing, and it just hopefully will inspire you that there's so much you can learn about your body and about physics and how you can manipulate sound waves with your voice, right? That's what we are. We're kind of like energy wizards, and we learn how to amplify and accelerate certain sounds so that they carry more. So when those harmonics, the harmonic series, when we're making a sound and our vowel shapes and the shape of the vocal tract is changing and emphasizing different harmonics, it pulls them out more and amplifies them. And that's essentially like that's about as far as I'm going to go into that part of things. And we might come back to it a little bit, but it's sort of like a lightning round explanation, right? There's something happening with our vocal folds, and then there's something happening with the vocal tract, and that's creating the resounding effect, right? Is the vocal tract. Um, Now, everything needs a push to get the sound to happen. So the vocal folds, when we do our like vocal support, right? When we blow air over a bottle or something like that, right? When we strike something, that's giving it the push. And then the resounding effect is the resonance thing. So think of resonance as like your accelerator pads, right? I always like to use like it's like a race car kind of a thing. Like you're giving your initial push, your engine's moving, and then when you get into a resonator and you're particular about the shape and position and you get those sweet spots, it accelerates your voice, brings more buoyancy into the sound. And often we hear pitches as being kind of flat or under pitch because we don't have good resonance, and it doesn't carry and sort of have the right kind of stability. And so that's sometimes like when we think of getting really perfect intonation or pitch control, it actually has a lot to do with our understanding of resonance as well. And so it's very, very important. It's often kind of neglected. People just say, you need to project your voice more. Um, uh, yeah. So yeah, that's sort of the idea. Yeah, it's kind of like lift off. I think that's what you're saying, right? It kind of creates the buoyancy in your voice. Um, so those are kind of like the main things that I wanted to sort of talk about. And so another thing too is you can think of like the resonators. Like, how can we change our resonators? This is going to get into where we start singing and start feeling this out. Because again, you can talk about this all you want, but we want to find this in our voice. And there's actually some really easy ways to do that. Um, yeah, that's all good. So resonators, we can change essentially our jaw, our tongue, our lips, the palate, the pharynx, and the larynx. And these are all ways that we modify things, some for better or for worse in certain circumstances, right? So sometimes we talk about trying to not use our jaw and try to use our tongue instead because of certain habits that a lot of us have because of speech and things like that. And think of like a resonator in itself can change, it can modulate things by changing the size and the shape, the density of the walls, right? Some of these things are a little more particular to each body, right? And so some things are going to be less flexible than others, but the size and the shape definitely, and the opening, right? So when we think about all of those different parts of our body, right? The lips and the tongue, these are all things that are changing the size and the shape of our resonator or our vocal tract. Um, and what that does is when the shape is smaller, we get higher pitches. And when the shape is bigger, we get lower pitches. So you can think of all musical instruments as following this kind of similar thing. Now, there's one interesting factor that I want to mention before we dive in. The vocal tract is weird because we have kind of two chambers that interact with each other in different variables. We have the space essentially like behind the tongue and by the larynx behind the tongue, and then we have this space right here in front of the tongue and through the mouth. And those two things are kind of these two different resonator chambers. So you can think of it almost like two different bottles, right? Like if you have like bottles and you blow into bottles, right? And you have a different amounts of water in each one, right? They're going to have different pitches. And you can think of when our tongue moves around, what's happening is it's changing the size and the shape of one compared to the other. So that's as far as I'm going to go in that. You can get really technical, but I think sometimes that's maybe not as helpful as we would think. There are all sorts of cool sort of vocal spectrogram analyzers like Voce Vista. Like there's a number of these that essentially help us filter our listening and hear and see and visualize those different overtones better. And so sometimes people will use those as they're doing their practices, although a lot of teachers will tell you that kind of only goes so far. It's really cool, but really you want to learn how to do this with your own perception of your voice and also with the feedback of a teacher. So those are the kind of the main things. So when we're talking about our resonators, we're talking about really the shape of our vocal tract, right, and our vowels. And these are our main sort of things that we use as we sing, right? Vowels and consonants, right? So every vowel shape has kind of like a sweet spot to it. And so we'll kind of talk about that as we go. And ultimately, one thing we want to do is just try to find flexibility with these muscles. So this is why we talk so much about like tension and things like that. When these muscles are more rigid, we can't modify them as well. And so they get kind of stuck with one type of tone quality, or we'll kind of overly max out the system because you're trying one resonant strategy that's not as effective for wherever you're singing. And that's where we lead to vocal tension issues and ultimately damage, is just when you use your mechanism incorrectly or in a way that is not super efficient for whatever you're doing. So let's start to find our resonance. So there's a couple ways that we can do this. If you follow me, this will all uh, be review, in a lot of ways. But every once in a while, I do a practice that's just particular to my resonance, especially when I'm trying to rehabilitate my voice if I've been sick or I feel like I've maybe oversung a little bit. Resonance is a great way to find that efficiency and to relax the mechanism, to clear off any gunk that gets in your vocal folds. It's a really, really helpful thing to do. And so there's a reason again why I do a lot of like tension release stuff, try to get flexibility of this mechanism, just so I can start to get everything kind of loose and separated, right? We want our vocal tract to be kind of free floating a little bit, right? We want it to be able to move, right? So swallowing is really healthy for a singer. It'll reset your larynx. Taking a moment and just feeling out that mobility very, very gently and working on relaxing the muscles around the larynx that can kind of hold it in place and often will block the resonance if we're too tight, right? So relaxing the shoulders, doing all of this stuff can actually help you a lot more than trying to like force a sound, right? So when I talk about like forced resonance compared to natural resonance, technically like everything like forced resonance is like a technical acoustic term. But when we talk about like good resonance, it's a very specific type where we are amplifying these particular overtones that help our voice work. And when we're forcing resonance, we're often doing it by squeezing or straining or overly trying to push the mechanism. So we can over support something, we can over tighten and try to squeeze something to make higher overtones. And that can lead us to a lot of really frustrating sort of vicious cycles. So find a note that's sort of low in your range at first. And one thing that I like to do is work on freeing up my resonators using SOVTs. So actually using a hum is really, really helpful because it gives us a little bit more of that sort of back pressure. It helps the resonance work because it can resound more around the walls. Now, is still an opening, which is my nose. Important to note, I forgot one really important fact that leads to understanding some red flags, and this will play throughout as we continue the lesson. A resonator has to have some particular things for it to be a resonator. It's very simple. It has to have an opening and it has to have empty space. So our vocal tract, right, has an opening. It's my lips. And it has this chasm, right, that goes all the way down to the vocal folds, right, and through the larynx. Uh, that makes it a true resonator. Now, there are some things that sympathetically vibrate that aren't really resonators that people sometimes will try to get you to find resonance in, and it's kind of the wrong way of thinking about it. It's a good perception to feel vibration in your whole body. It tells you you're like resonating well, but the chest, right? The chest does not function as a resonator. There's no opening there that really works like that. It does vibrate with everything sympathetically. Same thing with the head, right? So chest voice and head voice, right? Again, more of a metaphor for this acoustic sort of resonance thing that's happening with our voice. The nose is technically fits as a resonator, but it's not very helpful because it doesn't move or doesn't change as much as these other things that we can do in the vocal tract. So it works, but it's very, very limited and it's such a small space. that we tend to avoid that as our overarching technique, just trying to sing into the nose. Um, and so it's just important to note, right? When someone is like, you need to open your chest more to get more resonance, that actually is a red flag. It's wrong. It doesn't. It's scientifically incorrect. Same thing about the anything with like the head, right? We this concept of creating space, while helpful, is really just telling when we create space. It's more like relaxing things and doing the right kinds of resonant tricks in order for us to feel like there's more space. It's a perceptive thing, right? So we're actually not trying to like overly sort of like create more space. There's a limit to how much we can actually do with that. There's a little bit we can do with stretching. And, when we lower our larynx, we're elongating the entire tube. When we bring our lips out a little more, we're elongating the entire resonant tube, and that does have an effect. So a little bit of that goes a certain direction. But if you're struggling a lot and a teacher's telling you, you need more space, it just know that it's more of a perceptive term and you don't need to actually like hold something because then you're just locking muscles and you're going to run into that sort of problem of being too rigid actually. So it's just more complex than that. Perception is great. It's again, I use that all the time. That's how we use our voice, right? Is through our perception of it. But just know that these things can be misleading, especially if you understand the physics and acoustics behind it and voice science. So just like demystifies that. And anytime you see someone online talking about that, like singing from the diaphragm or like, any of these kinds of terms, right? That's like not quite a correct support concept term or, trying to open your chest or anything like that. It's more just that it's a postural thing, right? A lot of times when we are able to keep our chest more relaxed, things like that helps with vocal support and helps our muscles stay looser, right? So that they don't kind of back up into our vocal tract area. Yes, let's go. Yes, I'm sorry, I kind of went off a little far on that, and we'll come back to it maybe for another class sometime if you all want. But let's get to the resonant stuff. So when we do a hum, this actually helps us it helps us find resonance. Now, what I do is I try to move my resonators around a little bit. So rather than like trying to open space, it's more about the flexibility of the mechanism. So this will make sense as we keep going to a little bit more if you're struggling with it. But I'll show you what I mean. I'll do like a hum, and I go like. Do you hear that kind of like didgeridoo, like sort of like zing zing kind of a sound? I'm going to hear it clearer than you do. I'm going to do it higher up too, so you guys can really, really hear it. But you'll hear it internally as you do this. I'm moving my tongue up and down, right? So this is one of the major movers of our vowel shapes or our formants, going like ya 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 ya, and then wah 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 wah. I'm using what I call glides. These are helpful because we go from a small space to a big space, and we're feeling out the flexibility of our resonator systems. I don't really move the larynx with it, although you can feel like when I talk about like a neutral larynx concept, you can feel a little bit of elongation of the larynx. The larynx will kind of naturally track a little bit with things. When our larynx lifts, it makes the space smaller, it makes brighter sound. When it drops, it makes a darker sound. But we don't want to try to manipulate this too much because it can lead to issues around the throat. So think of like we tend to want to get out of the way of the oscillator of our vocal folds. So when you think, if you're trying to like, for example, get your larynx to move a little bit, think about it when you take your breath. So I call this sort of like the neutral vowel breath, right? If I'm like, have like an and I go like, this is sometimes one thing that people mean, especially in in the classical realm, when they're trying to create more space, is actually by lowering the larynx a little bit. But there's a limit to how much we can do with that, and you don't have to over accentuate that. But if you're finding you're having trouble with this will bump your overtones actually by trying to just get your throat to relax a little bit. That's why I had this sort of do the laryngeal massage thing too, right? Like just to get the throat. kind of relax and open. And then you can think of breathing in through that shape, like and you'll see the larynx will kind of move with the tongue just by nature. Although we're trying to separate these things out a little bit. It's like a physical force, so it takes some time and some repetition to do these kinds of things. So anyways, I would explore low in your range, just trying to move these things. Don't try to push harder or move things like more intensely to make it happen. It's actually just got to sort of separate out with some repetition. So as I do this, I'll move my head around, just try to get loose. It's very meditative, very healthy on the voice. So going like Isn't that funny, right? These things work really quickly, actually, as you're starting to do them. If you have a lot of tension and things that you're working through, be patient with it. But this is a very, very helpful mechanism. Now I'll do it a little higher, and hopefully you'll start to hear more of these overtones come out from the different sort of changes of shape. So if I'm like up here, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. That feeling of dropping the larynx will definitely help affect the resonator a little bit. So it's kind of like classical technique 101. You can overdo it, so just be careful with that. I'm going to do this up higher, and you'll hear even more. So watch if I'm like. So play around with that. And then we can do it with our mouth open, and we start to play around with our glides. So glides are a really fast way to check in with resonance. That was still in my chest voice, and we'll get to some head voice things in a second too. Slightly different strategy. So with this, I'm gonna go like yeah, yeah, yeah. So this is kind of one of our most important glide. When you think about it, right, as the tongue is coming up and down and a little bit forward, it's changing these variables of these different sort of containers. So when our tongue is high, we have a smaller space. E, A, and we try to do this without the other things moving. So a lot of times with resonators, if they're all moving all at the same time and we're doing a lot of this, we're often blocking overtones at the same time that we're creating them. And so it leads to this kind of vicious cycle. And so that's why we want to create this muscle isolation. Like really trying to have a loose, floppy jaw. Be like, one thing that can help you is plugging your nose just perceptively. It might help you feel and perceive this in a little bit of a different way. Sometimes we can get really confused by the sort of mask and sinuses. There's a lot of sensations here. So you could try it like this too. And just with vowels. So like, can you hear how that, especially the E vowel, right, has a very different kind of higher harmonic that we hear out of it, right, or higher overtone that comes out of it when we're in that position compared to an A and an Ah. And the more you do this, and the more flexible it gets, the more you'll start to perceive and feel that. So again, that's the first main glide. Changes things here, changes the size and shape. When we do, I'm changing the opening, right? And that's also changing the size and shape of the mechanism. So wah is also a good sort of refiner of overtones. And different strategies for different styles will often emphasize one side more than the other, like having really neutral, relaxed space here to provide warmth for the sound, and then doing a lot here. And then sometimes it's completely relaxing this area and doing a lot more, kind of moving through things like this to create sort of these higher overtones like twang resonance, right? When we go like, Nya, nya, nya. Right, I'm taking the tongue and moving it forward. Nya, nya, nya. It's gonna give me maybe what people consider like a brighter sound, versus if I go right? Isn't this fun, right? So it's actually a really cool thing to try this out. It's something that I love doing with my students because once you understand that singing is about sort of surfing these different overtones, it sort of cracks the code on how we actually use our voice, demystifies a lot of things. Um, it is really strangely complex if you're dealing with like the first formant bumping the first harmonic or the second harmonic or the third harmonic, and like that gets to like some really highly technical stuff. I do just put like a caveat there that we ultimately use our voice in this more intuitive kind of a way. So you can't, you don't want to like think about this like every moment, like this highly technical thing. You just don't really flow very much with your voice when you do it that way. It's more through some primitive sensations and things like this, like using your glides. So any song or any exercise where I'm going like, way, I'm trying to feel out that resonance, and I do it in different places, right? I'd be like, way, and it'll feel like a little gummy at first until you get other things to detach, and then you'll hear this change from A to ah. I'm doing the W2, just kind of working that in there, but way, right, this is how we perceive sound, right? We're kind of sort of like dolphins, right? We actually perceive it, we perceive comprehension through these changes of vowel shapes, right? And these bumping, sort of bumping different overtones. Um, and so when I'm doing this, I'm really just, that's actually the game. I'm doing this sort of resonance push up. I'm trying to go like, way, kind of moving that around, right? So like, way, keeping it simple, just moving from one vowel formant to the next. I might do way o, get a different feeling, right? So this is why I do this. I'm kind of systematically feeling out these transitions, like way, right? And these are kind of more from the middle, so we get more subtle as we do that. So you can take any exercise that you're doing and use glides. So it can be like ya or wah, and they're kind of a way to jumpstart or sort of spark the resonance, right? So wah 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 ya ya ya. So if you'll hear actually over the course of just these like last 10 minutes of doing this, I'm getting way more resonance or resonance, right? Rebounding waves that are amping off of each other. And it's sort of hard to differentiate all these tiers of overtones, but just know that when you get a relaxed vocal tract, that's kind of the first thing, is just getting everything loose and relaxed. So that's why a lot of people do these things where they're like blah blah blah, like neutral vowels and things to get people to just relax, right? Kind of moving the tongue around. I've seen some people do this, kind of weird, right? Where you're like, oh, they're trying to just get, I don't do that as much because it's kind of weird, but because there's other ways to relax your tongue. But ultimately, we're just trying to get the throat relaxed. It has a natural boosting of resonance just by nature of being a vocal tract, right? So it's already an instrument. And so that's one cool thing is, it kind of helps to understand why less is more with the voice, and why you look at some really great singers and it doesn't look like they're doing too much because they're just using that natural resonance, and they found release through daily practice, and through tension release kinds of exercises already makes your voice resonant. Then when we get the right kind of vowel shape, that kind of is like the next accelerator pad. And then what that does is it boosts something called the singer's formant, which is this really high pingy ring. That's what you're probably hearing in my voice right now. Um, yeah, Frank Sinatra. Yeah, it's basically like all singers are doing this to varying degrees, and with different strategies, right? It's just one of the variables with our voice. We need breath support to give us that push, and then we have this resonance happening in these specific cycles, and then vibrato happens, and that helps to amplify all of those things, right? It starts to kind of do this. So all of these forces work together. So if I'm like, like yeah, yeah. Think of it as like these pushes, right? It's going like, right? The resonance is bouncing back to the vocal folds, and the whole thing is like this juggling act that's happening. It's kind of a really cool way to think about how your voice works. So when in doubt, find glides. And so let me like point out how this is super applicable, even though it seems like a really simple concept. Like some common things, like words like, let's say I go from the word me to up. Now, when I speak, me, up, they're kind of separate. But if I go like, me, do you hear the glide in there? I go, me, because I'm going from E to ah, so my tongue is naturally going to create a glide. I'm going to go, me, I use that to my advantage, right? So in a high range, I could be like, me, me, and I can get more resonance coming through my voice when I understand that there's a glide hidden in there, right? Or another one like I am, right? Kind of how we say it, but I am. It's kind of flashing through that whole moment, right? So our glides and our diphthongs are all ways to do this. Sometimes we run into issues when we go like, and we get kind of stuck in between, right? Right? So I'm practicing moving from one sort of cool resonant spot to the next. The more of these you hit as you're singing, just the more the voice keeps floating, right? So if you think of it like a game like that, that's really what's happening. I'm like juggling some balls in the air, using my vocal support to get them in the air. And then resonance is this magic trick that keeps the balls floating without needing hands anymore, right? So that's kind of the cool thing. Once we get resonance, we can kind of coast on things for a little bit, and it nourishes the voice. So find your yaws and your wahs, right? So another one, right, is working through like wah, we, wah, ya, wah. And then eventually, I like to practice sort of moving through them fluidly. So I do this thing called the circle of vowels, and I go like, and I keep doing it until I get smoother and smoother. So like, now, if you're listening really closely, do you hear the harmonic series a little bit? Right? It's kind of this fun sort of like magic trick. Let me play it again so you hear it, right? Or maybe I'll do it a little higher, like. And I go like. You hear that E vowel has a very high resonant point that it works with. So let's talk about head voice, right? So chest voice is kind of a more easily accessible thing because it's our speech voice register, right? So it tends to be where most of us talk. You can talk in head voice. It's just sort of a cultural thing sometimes, and also just what feels most comfortable for the voice. But most of the time we're speaking in chest voice. So when people talk about like the primitive understanding of resonant strategies, we do this already. Imagine you're calling out to someone. You'll see like test my range apps that are starting to pop up, and they say like, say, call out like you're going hey to someone far away and going like, hey, hey, hey. It's a very particular harmonic that we're emphasizing that makes that happen. That's like chest voice. I know, isn't it? It's kind of like a magic trick. This is why I kind of really get a kick out of doing resonance. And it's my primary mode of doing things. Although if you overly focus on resonance, sometimes you forget about your vocal support. So we mix and match our practices. And often a quality full practice will have a bit of both and will oscillate between the two different strategies. So like using SOVTs and then doing your consonant work and then also working on glides and getting flexibility, relaxing your jaw, all of these kinds of things are going to help. Then you're just more in control of your system. So we got hey, right? That's our kind of very primitive thing. The other side or the other strategy is the whoop strategy. So this is imagining like you're cheering or you're doing basically just this sound, right? It's like woo, 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 right? You can think of like that as sometimes like a way that people do calls, right? In big canyons, right? Because it's super high resonance and it carries really, really far. And that's why we woo, you, right? It's that kind of sound. So it's, the primitive way of thinking about this. It's think of like cooing like a dove or like woo, 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 right? The hooting like an owl, right? These are all ways that people try to get imitation in a primitive way. It's a resonant strategy. And you'll notice when I go, woo, the vocal tract kind of has a different position that it wants to stay in compared to, hey, hey, right? You see how this goes using a different container compared to, right? That's the back throat one, right? Versus the mouth one, right? If you're thinking of the two different sort of container concept of way of thinking and simplifying resonance. So you can think of like the bright to dark dimension, right? Contemporary music being more that one, and classical music's, again, very overgeneralized here, being like that one, right? So it's just there's a primitive way of understanding this, there's a sound way of understanding it, and you can actually kind of see it physically a little bit, although we don't want to overemphasize that too much, right? Because then we might lock things. So in head voice, we want to use these nice sort of smaller, more narrow vowel shapes, and that's going to be more helpful for us. So like it has that higher overtone that's natural in the shape of the sound. It just helps us find out these registrations. You ultimately want to be able to use every vowel and every register, but you might find it's harder to access when you go, ha, ha. It might pull you down to a lower format until you're used to the shape and position. So like, it sounds less like my speaking voice, right? And it feels like it's further up here, right, in my head. That's partially what the effect of that different resonance strategy has. This is why we call it head voice and chest voice, because of the sensation, but it's all happening right here, right? And that's the trick. It's once you realize that, it's like obviously, right? It actually is very logical. But you'll hear people say like sing from your chest and do all these things, and it's like no, it's here, right? So when we're going like I'm thinking about a little bit more of that concept of lowering and stretching this way a little bit. And the cool thing is, and this is where it's hard, and I have to be careful about how I say things because it can kind of confuse people. We don't place resonance. Resonance, when we make a sound, it is going in all directions, but we have a feeling or sensation associated with it. It's, again, this is like the science over trumping over some of the perception things. The resonance is going everywhere. In fact, if you can start to perceive it in all these different directions, that's going to help you, because when we try to place resonance, we often hold around it or kind of force something in a certain direction. So we want this to be all kind of like fluid and seamless. And eventually our practice and isolation of these things just helps the body take over. And I'm just trying to find resonance, and that comes through I feel more release, more buoyancy, more ease of singing. And often when things are neutral here in the vocal tract and you're doing this appropriately, it'll naturally kind of take its own space or modify the shape to get that kind of resonance. So once you're focused on resonance and you're listening like that, it changes the way you think about your voice entirely. So all of a sudden, I'm just thinking neutral, very neutral eval. I'm going like, and it's just naturally doing that. All right. So we can all do this, and less is more. We often want to do something, and that's usually what's messing with people when they go like, "Eh, eh," right? Squeezing versus vocal support is helpful. We need breath pressure. Um, uh, yes, you do want to feel a little bit of that adduction, right? It's a balance of those forces. So when we're talking about adduction and abduction, everybody, we're talking about the vocal folds coming together. Now, head voice, technically, what's happening, and it's a primitive thing, and I could explain the acoustics and the physiology, but we can just do this naturally because our voice is connected to our mind and our ability to control these things, but in a primitive way. That's why we talk about like, woo! Technically, when we go into head voice, we're using less surface area of the vocal folds, and it's trying to abduct more. It's protecting itself, and that's also just how we emphasize. It just helps. It helps us get the right kind of it helps us work with our resonators, and that's going to change some of the harmonics and things like that. And when we do that, it tends to want to abduct too much, and that can be an issue. And then we lose vocal support pressure. And so we talk about chord compression, and we try to get more adduction. Now that can also, you can do too much of that too. If you're overly squeezing, eventually you'll get the squeak sound, right? You'll be like, right? It's too much adduction. So again, it can go either way for people, but typically we tend to have less of that as we go up higher, and we're trying to make a little bit more within reason, right? And then in chest voice, people tend to have too much of that adduction, too much surface area. That leads to that shouting kind of a sound that can be really harmful on the voice. And we're trying to get a little more abduction. We're trying to get a little bit more relaxed vocal folds. So this is where registration comes in. I'm not going to go too far this way because I'm starting to get a little too advanced. But when we think about all of this happening, it's not as linear as we would like to think. We can actually do all sorts of cool things that can start to mix these different resonance strategies, and we can start to get a change of chord compression and all these other things by adjusting our formants and our vowel shapes. So this is why when we talk about mixing, we're often getting people to go from one vowel like to and all these other things because we're trying to get the best of all these different harmonic strategies. And it kind of gets the vocal folds in this cool, like in between sort of place. The cool fun fact is technically there are an infinite number of formants that help us create resonance. It's a cool thing. It's very weird. Think of it more like we're so used to thinking about vowel shapes as particular shapes because of how we speak. And there are places where we get very clearly measurable acoustic events that happen. And you can talk about different styles, and we could do a really advanced one where we're talking about different acoustic events for like the musical theater belter compared to like the classical operatic tenor or something like that. There's certain events that happen in particular ranges. It doesn't even matter what voice type you are, really. I mean, a little bit, but it's actually about where that range is in particular. The energy and like difficulty of it, yes, a little bit with whatever voice type you are, but it's actually just like acoustic phenomenon. But this is where we run into this issue of like different languages have slightly different formats and different positions of vowels. And then you could extrapolate on that and be like, it's actually more of a wave and less of a particle, right? If we think of every vowel and we're like, ooh, eh, ah, and we're thinking about it that way, we're missing that effect of the glide, right? We're missing our ability to see it as a spectrum, a sliding scale. So that's why it's infinite, actually, right? If I'm like, or I can change a lot that way. Also, when you add in all these other physics forces like um, kinetic energy or potential energy, or like how fast you're moving through certain areas of your range and what pitch you're on and everything. So yada yada yada. You can go down that rabbit hole, and it's like maybe not as helpful as you think. And really, the secret here is to feel out these glides. So like, and it's just a tendency that we tend to want to lock or hold around the places that are most stable. And actually, the best way of feeling this out is to try to break that a little bit. We all do it. It's just product of speaking and certain singing habits and things like that. So I'm doing this to open up my voice and open up my resonators all the time, right? So you can do the same thing in head voice. Like, note the difference. Like if I'm in chest voice and I'm going like, let's try. Let's do a simple one like E to oo. Do you hear that change of the overtone? Right, it's a little lower on the oo, and it goes up to the e as like slightly higher overtone. Kind of feels like it's like right here for me, right? Very atypical for chest voice. Actually, kind of feeling like more here in the mask a little bit. And then if I go into head voice and I'm like, let's do it here, like. You hear that overtone is like up there pretty much, right? It's a higher overtone that I'm creating stability with that particular type of singing, right? With that registration. So most of the time when people have trouble with head voice, for example, they're not really perceiving that overtone as high enough. They're not used to it, right? They're not listening to it. And strangely enough, the second we start perceiving that, head voice becomes more available to people, which I find is really cool. So where is it? Like try to feel it out. Where do you feel it? And move your hand a little bit. Perception is still helpful. So if I'm like, if I'm up here, like let's do like, it's like even higher, right? So a little bit, right? The tiniest bit. We'll start to perceive it as maybe up a little higher. Some of that has to maybe do with like also just the amount of energy required to go up to higher parts of different registers. But you'll feel, right, it's up here. So play around with your head voice and pay attention to where you feel the resonance. This is partially why we explain it as head voice and chest voice. And you can feel sympathetic vibration, right? If I'm like, I can feel vibration here. And if I go, less influence there, right, when I tap it a little bit. And if I'm like, I'm gonna feel it, actually more here than like actually on your head a lot of, and sometimes people feel it here a little bit. We have trouble feeling anything here, actually, right? We don't really feel our brain, so you'll feel it kind of more like back here behind your ear. Good question. I've had to work on it, and I've increased my range over practice and time. And actually, it's funny doing this stuff more in the years I've been really focusing on 30 Day Singer and kind of doubling down on explaining and teaching things. It's actually helped improve and increase my range. Some of it's also because I'm working with students all the time. But I used to have tension issues. When I was a kid, like I actually had to go on vocal rest a lot, like because I wasn't, I'm sometimes I have a very exaggerative voice and very, partially personality. I get excited about things, right? And I was fatiguing myself a lot because I wasn't really doing things the right way. It was one of my first introductions to voice teachers, and that I had a voice teacher who helped me fix that habit of chronically getting kind of hoarse and getting that kind of raspy voice. Maybe in some ways you could say it helped strengthen some things, is like that process. But ultimately, when we do this kind of stuff, it allows our vocal folds to get stronger on their own. It creates more elasticity with the vocal folds so they can stretch more, and therefore we can actually extend our range. So, yeah, like there are some things specific to like I'm a tenor, and so like I'm gonna have typically like a higher range, but as a tenor, I also work on extending lower, getting more warmth in my tone. Right, when we get more of these lower partials, it gives us more warmth and richness to our sound. Whereas we go up to these higher things, we get more brightness in the sound. So sometimes a tenor can get like overly bright, and that can be a problem in certain situations. Uh, but like, no, like range is something that you expand through this kind of practice and through the understanding of resonance. And a lot of times people have issues with their range being limited because they're not perceiving this kind of stuff, right? They're not able to get resonance. And so they can't energize the voice in a way that actually allows it to get to these higher formants. So you can think of almost like electron orbitals, right? Like, can you bump yourself up to these higher overtones and get to the singer's formant? When you get to the singer's formant, and beyond, right? But that's kind of a very obvious measurable one that people will do. You've got a very resonant voice. We don't have to have everything be 100% resonant, but tracking this out in your voice is a great way to make sure you're staying healthy. Um, it helps you maintain stability with your vocal folds without pushing. So when in doubt, you can adjust a lot of different things, but I'm just focusing right now again on the tongue. Ya, 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 which can go up and down. It can go nya, 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 get like kind of brighter sometimes this way, or it can go a little further back. Ya, 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 nya, nya, nya. That can create some things. A little bit of adjusting our palate. So when I do exercises like talking about the mix, and this is why this can be lost on people, the complexity sometimes of these different forces that overlap on each other. But we can adjust the palate and do a little bit of that, like oh, ah, ah, kind of a thing. That's also a little bit with the tongue. And that's where I do these more complicated things that seem simple, where I can get like mixed voice kind of techniques, right? Where I'm like, it's like, that's like the whiny sort of baby sound, but I can boost up to this crazy higher area. It's not like it actually requires much more force because I'm utilizing resonance as a strategy. Take some time to figure out how to get on the balance board like that, right? Without hurting yourself. So don't try that at home unless you're working with a teacher and you're building resilience into your voice. But I'm like adjusting some things here, and that's also helping me boost certain formats. And again, the cool thing is understand this as a functional thing. Like there are infinite options. There are ones that tend to work very well for most people or for different kinds of voice types, because the larynx is a larynx and it's generally kind of the same. It changes in shape and size a little bit, right? And that's why we have different voice types and things like that, different tone qualities of different singers. But we have a range that we can modify with that. And there's a lot of in between places. So the point is like people can find all sorts of cool resonant strategies for different things that they're doing and create their own sound. Just pay attention to how it feels and make sure that you're getting stability and you're not squeezing or trying to hold something to make that happen. But you can explore and actually, find your own ways of doing things. And that's kind of like a way of explaining different genres, right? We tend to want to sit in certain registers more, do certain kinds of sounds to imitate other instruments because the genre kind of demands it. And we find these techniques that make us do it more in a more repeatable way, and have longevity so that we can have long lasting careers as singers. So we have different strategies, right? But think of it as all this whole spectrum of variables that move around. If you think of it that way, you can move through different styles more effortlessly, right? So resonance is like kind of the key to unlocking the voice, I think, and that's why I do a lot of work helping people understand that. And just know that you can adjust all these different variables, and the best thing to do is to utilize all of them to a small capacity. When you overload one variable or one resonator, it tends to get stuck, right? So people who are belters tend to have problems with the tongue kind of locking into a high position. people who sing classical music and try to lower their larynx, they get problems with the tongue pulling back and locking the larynx that way because they're overutilizing one resonant strategy. So mix and match and actually explore different genres, right? It's kind of a good proof for like it's helpful to explore different genres because you understand the range of motion a little bit better. Um, so yeah, hopefully this is starting to make sense for people. And we'll do more of this, of course. Resonance is always a factor in all the singing that we do. And ultimately it's the guide to how we start to learn mixed voice technique or ability to mix and match different strategies, find really smooth transitions of resonance, right? Think of it as like a handoff from one formant to the next. And always just pay attention to how you feel too. And you can use these analyzers, right? You can use like Spectrum View is like a free one that you can sing into your phone, and it'll show you your overtones. It'll show you what you are doing with the resonators, and if you're uh, bumping certain areas appropriately, or you are lacking resonance, or you're blocking resonance, and things like that. And just know that like the tongue and the lips and these kinds of things can be really, really useful. And little small changes can go big, that can have a really big effect on the voice. So even like things like subtly rounding over the lips and subtly dropping the tongue and even just dropping and relaxing the jaw a little bit. So this is why people talk about that too, of like, like we can overdo it, right? But dropping and relaxing the jaw changes the variables of the resonator. So, um, yeah. So it just depends on, when someone asks something like, what should I focus on using resonance for singing higher? My question would be like, in what register? Um, and then also it's particular often to hearing the voice and hearing what you're doing as your strategy. And this is where a voice teacher comes in, right? I can kind of hear certain strategies. Okay, yeah. So for head voice, the idea is you're going to want to neutralize a little bit in the front, and then focus on more sort of back of the throat exercises. Often chord compression also helps too, in tandem with this. But just like what I was talking about, it's this feeling of like out your back molars, kind of this feeling, and dropping. Sometimes people talk about like the inner smile, which is inside, not here. I can tell a singer who's like learned the inner smile incorrectly when they're like this, because this part doesn't do that much. It's more like back there where you can't see it. If you do a cross section, you can see a little smile of the pharynx, right? So you focus on that kind of thing. I would also use things like an NG sound, for example. This is helpful for almost every register, but doing things where you're going like, because you're kind of focusing more on that sort of back placement. So like, this is why I do this one where I'm like, sing freely. I'm using the as an SOVT, feeling my pressure out. And then trying to get good chord compression from there as I rise up to my E vowel. So there's different strategies for different people and different contexts and situations, but that's kind of that feeling. As we go up to our highest note, it kind of like looks a little bit like a snake unhinging. I highly recommend like look up the singer Beverly Sills, like old classical singer, and you can see what it looks like when someone sings an effortless like high C. And I just think she had an underappreciated singer who wasn't as like famous as some people maybe perhaps, but has like stellar, almost like perfect technique. So there's like this one, like the Willow songs, kind of like a famous one, and she goes up to this really high note and then effortlessly floats back down, and you just look at her face and she's like, there's this kind of particular look, right? So some of it you have to feel out and do it incrementally, of course, but start with maybe like your E and your U vowels. Although sometimes with sopranos, like I have a little less experience on doing like tippy top sopranos because I tend to be more of a middle voice singer, which is helpful for like most singers. But I don't really have the experiences of like a basso profundo. Low bass singers have very particular things on that side of the spectrum. And sopranos have very particular things on that side of the spectrum that they talk about experientially a lot. It's like, think of me as I like sit in the middle and have like a good wide range, but those are those two extremes that I, unfortunately, as a middle voice singer, I don't have as much access to. Although I can get up to like high C's and things like that. It's just very, very loud. And so it has a very kind of different sort of quality. Maybe that's just a limitation of my own technique as well. But yes, voice types have some barriers too. But yeah, I would focus on that kind of a thing. This feeling of stretching, using NGs, chord compression practice. And then what I was going to say with sopranos is sometimes the bigger vowels make you work a little bit more. And so I've found like success just fluctuating through different vowels and be like, try it on. And then all of a sudden this like perfect, beautiful high head voice sound comes out too. So don't get too lost in the strategies that try to help us. Because again, there are, as the science tells us, there's a lot that we don't know, right? And science is only able to measure really obvious events, right? So just also know there's a limitation to what we can perceive and how we reduce down a really complex system, right? So there's like, it's not just about that point, but it's about how we got there and all these other forces that are like just a little bit harder to calculate at this point. Maybe in the future we'll have more like powerful AI generated models with like robotics that can help us do this, right? And actually have sensors on every little aspect. If we can, just think about that. It's like there's a challenge there. You're your best guide when it comes to the sensations ultimately. And so me as a teacher, I'm just trying to get people to those sensations. And if it works, good, and I'll tell you from sort of mirroring if there's things that look like there's, tension or it's an ineffective system. And you can do it also analyzing overtones and use theory, like theoretical acoustic things too. So hopefully this has just been like eye-opening. Again, the actual exercises can be pretty simple. And it's a way of filtering your listening as you're singing, but focus on glides, wah, yaw, moving from one vowel shape to the next, using humming, and using like the NG is really great for finding that back variable. Using different SOVTs can help us hone in on different parts of our vocal tract and really start to feel what it's like to get resonance in a certain spot. Again, perceptively, it's moving in all directions, but we tend to have sort of shared experiences with this. So I think that's everything. I'm just looking at my notes, right? I keep a little chart over here so I can make sure I have my key points. Yeah, drones, SOVTs, glides. Yeah, there's, obviously a lot more that we can do with this. And when we talk about mixed voice singing, this is kind of like a prerequisite, is understanding this a little bit with your voice. And then we can do all sorts of cool, magical things, right? Like the ability to be like, no, 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 finding a particular overtone. Ah, the reason that sounds different, the same notes, right, is because using different resonance strategies that are very hard to see externally, right? So again, this is why good singers look like they're just opening their mouth and stuff is coming out because it's pretty subtle. So yeah, hopefully that was helpful. Again, I really, really think this is one of the most important things you can understand about the voice. And do some research, check it out. There's all sorts of cool things about it. Just know there's a practical approach too. Check out any of the other content I do on resonators. This time I did a little more explanation too. And so we'll come back to this one again, and maybe like I'll do like exercise warm up just to open up your resonators. It's like a particular kind of a thing. So I'll keep that in mind as well, because it's very nice to have like a practical flow once you understand this. But again, and I'll leave you with this is kind of the difficulty and frustration as a voice teacher is if someone's like, I don't care, just make me do the exercises, you might be missing a lot of information if you're just trying to only imitate and kind of just shooting in the dark. And so you can't just like go through the motions by rote. This happens a lot. People will do like the 30-day singer stuff, and then they'll come in a lesson and they just haven't figured out how to do it right because it's more subtle and they're not listening to the right kinds of things. And so understanding is a huge part of it too. So You're very welcome, and I'll catch y'all next week, and we'll just keep at it. So looking forward to it, and take care and have a good rest of your day.